Hey everyone, welcome back to Know Who Drives Return, brought to you by Boardroom Alpha. I'm David Drapkin, and today we're joined by Ajay Kochar, who's the president, CEO, and co-founder of lithium-ion battery recycling company LICY, continuing a bit of our de-SPAC series, speaking to CEOs who've gone through the de-SPAC process. So first of all, Ajay, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, David. Appreciate you having us on. Nice to chat to you.
As well. So before we get into the specifics of the business, why don't you give a little introduction to yourself, a bit about your background, where you come from?
Yeah, for sure. So background personally is pretty technical, engineer by background, chemical engineer. And so this is kind of, it interweaves heavily into the story of life cycle. So rewind 6-7 years ago, my co-founder, Tim Johnston, and I were in the lithium industry. So, every day, these days, everyone's very focused on lithium. All of a sudden, it's become way into focus for batteries and this whole industry. But reality is, 10, 12 years ago, this whole cycle of trying to develop started. And we were basically engineering the facilities that make lithium chemicals that go into the battery materials. So very battery driven, battery focused, and building these projects all around the world, and in a very nascent time as well for the industry, because if you rewind to then, Tesla was just emerging. You think back to what EVs were on the road at that time, there weren't really many. So, that kind of continued for some years. We were, again, working technically and also with investors too sometimes, and an engineering firm, consulting firm. And we kept getting asked, and we were wondering, hey, what is going to be the solution here for recycling? And probably the fourth or fifth time we got asked or were wondering about it, was I really dug into it. And the bottom line was we didn't find a fit for purpose solution to deal with all types of rechargeable lithium-ion batteries for sustainable recycling. So that was really the gap that we saw. It was a glaring hole in our minds. And we left our careers at that firm and started the company. So that was 2016. We'll get into it much more, but fast forward to today, we're 6-7 years in. So it's been a really exciting journey, but we're really getting started at the same time.
Yeah, wild ride in just a few short years. So talking from beginner standpoint about why lithium-ion recycling and the need for it and sort of the impetus behind the business.
Sure. So, zooming out, lithium-ion batteries, which everybody knows now, are everywhere in all sorts of devices. Like think around even your home, everything from your cordless lawnmower to leaf blower, probably to obviously phones, tablets, right? So if you kind of wrap your head around, it's everywhere. And why is that? Well, these batteries have been around for now going on 30 plus years commercially. And lithium's the lightest element on the periodic table after hydrogen and helium. So it's really electrochemically dense, meaning it can pack a lot of energy and not a lot of weight. So that was really the main reason, you've seen proliferation now into mobility. Like, of course, everybody knows electric vehicles, but also scooters, smaller mobility, et cetera. And a large part of that journey has been scaling. And so we've seen in the span of these 30 years, the battery go from being kind of in niche applications to getting a lot more use and more production begets more demand in some ways because the cost typically goes down. And then you've seen them, proliferate. So now as it's been happening, of course, it's commercially in electric vehicles, and we're really reaching that tipping point for penetration. You go from a space of saying, recycling is kind of this conceptual thing. First, let's get the cars on the road. To, whoa, there's a lot of batteries being made, and that's going to need to go somewhere once they're made and reach end of life. But also, as you make batteries, it's not perfect. Like any process, there's a level of yield loss or rejects. So these are the things coming to the forefront. And the last thing, just talking on that, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more, is we're living in a very interesting world around geopolitical considerations around localized supply, disrupted supply chains. Logistics is really difficult. So there's this big theme to try and balkanize, try and domesticate those supply chains. And now all of a sudden there's an issue of, okay, how do we get those materials into the batteries in the first place? And then how do we increase the recycled content over time? So I'll pause there, but that's basically what's happened in the last, especially 2 years, I would say.
And the narrative, and you keep saying it, and it's what you read, that is, big about electric vehicles. And so should we think about this as, is this purely driven by the growth in EVs, or is it, I know you mentioned other products, but where in terms of your business, would you rank sort of the importance of the proliferation of the electric vehicle market?
Yeah, it's number one for sure. I mean, in terms of demand driver for batteries, but we keep seeing other verticals surprise us. So, for example, energy storage, stationary energy storage. So people should think about utility scale storage, residential storage. This year alone, it's been surprising. We've done already 4 projects that are lithium-ion batteries that were in a utility scale, like grid scale energy storage.
Mm-hmm.
And those are large projects. So if you would have asked me maybe 18 months ago, I would have said, well, yeah, we see it here and there, but that's probably, 5 years away or 10 years away.
Right.
But there you go. That's an example where proliferation has, gone faster than any of us can expect. And I think that's a typical representation of this sort of adoption curve, right? You underestimate and you overestimate typically, right? So we're kind of on that underestimating part of it. And we're seeing way more applications. Back to your question, in brief, EV for sure, the biggest driver in terms of where batteries are being made for, in terms of manufacturing scrap, and then the ultimate end of life of those batteries.
So how much of the raw material out there is in dormant state, i.e. that's, not being used, that, has the opportunity to be recycled by someone like yourself?
Yeah, so let's just maybe talk North America, just for maybe context. So this year in 2022, and I'm going to talk in energy terms, I'm going to try and relate it to other terminology.
You have to dumb it down for me.
Yeah, that's like it. Yeah, it's a little confusing because there's a lot of units. So probably like 20 to 30 gigawatt hours of batteries available for recycling. Guess what does that mean? For example, the Tesla Gigafactory is 35, 40 gigawatt hours plus, of new production of batteries every year, and then there's a whole bunch of new factories coming, like GM with LG, etc. So that's a lot of batteries, and a lot of that is not necessarily full batteries. It typically is manufacturing rejects or scrap. So as batteries are made, you just think of like, making a cookie, right? So you have like a sheet of material and you're cutting out a cookie to size from there. We leave behind all sorts of scraps. Well, it's kind of similar to how batteries are made. You make a long sheet of material with a positive terminal, negative terminal. They're kind of cutting to size from that, and it leaves behind rejects. So that's actually a lot of material on the market today. And in terms of where you're getting at, also I think is, how much of it is actually being recycled and what's the infrastructure? I would say if it's, 20 to 30 gigawatt hours of available material to be recycled, there's probably about half of that available in recycling capacity. So there is this deficit that continues to grow of capacity to recycle versus how much is available on the market, and we see it firsthand in our business.
And so
that's where we stand today.
So how do you get to closing that gap, to narrowing that deficit there?
Yeah, it all takes hard execution, right? Yeah. So our history up until I'd say 2 years ago or so was really developing the technology, and I'm going to just cover that briefly because it's probably a good place to talk about it, and then I'll relate it to how we're building out. So traditionally, in recycling, it's kind of grouped into one thing. When people think recycling, you just think one industry. Of course, there's all sorts of parts to that supply chain, and really simply put, you basically have pre-processing and post-processing. So pre-processing is basically taking some battery or battery material and breaking it down to some sort of intermediate product, and then post is going back to some sort of finished good. So when people look at the space, you should try to divide it that way, and LICY does both. So that's what our spoke and hub terminology is that people see all over our materials. Think of it like a hub and spoke, but it's reverse logistics, right? So the spokes, what are we doing? These are regionalized networked facilities that get close to where batteries are. So we minimize the transportation distance to get it to the facility. Why is that important? Well, if you're in the shoes of like a GM or an LG, they don't want to be shipping their batteries halfway around the world. Probably not the safest thing to be doing either. So they prefer that it's closer, and hence more cost effective in terms of shipping too. So those are those facilities. We've innovated around that. We've talked about it more. But the bottom line is safety is really important. Scalability really important. Being environmentally friendly, not doing anything thermal, so that's not burning anything off, which is kind of the traditional way of doing it. and then generating these valuable materials close to where the batteries are. So we generate plastics, metals, a metal string, copper, aluminum, and then this thing that the industry's coined is black mass, which you'll see if you start researching about this industry. It's really just a black powder. So it's the cathode anode, the positive negative terminal in the battery, but that's really where the value is. So that's where lithium is, could be nickel, could be cobalt. So that's really, when you think about the cost in the battery, that's really the majority of it is that material. So that's what we do in the first stage. And then the second stage is the hub. We transform that black mass. So then we're networking from a range of spokes into a centralized hub. Why do we want to do that? We want to get economies of scale, that sort of process. It's a chemical process. And then we're going back to battery grade materials. So akin to what would come out of like a mine and refinery, basically that refined product on the back end. That's basically where we're going to what I call like the fundamental building blocks for batteries, almost think of like the bricks to the house, right? So you're building a house, it's kind of like the fundamental ingredients to make that end product.
Right.
So long, explanation. You asked, how do we bridge that gap? Well, this is the solution that we've been implementing, is building out spokes, servicing the need as batteries have been available for recycling and scaling. And so we're growing lockstep with that, and then closing the loop by rolling out this post-processing step, the hub, to go back to those materials that can stay within that supply chain domestically. So it's a multi-phase, enabled by technology, enabled by commercial strength. We're taking.
And so you brought up supply chain again. You mentioned this earlier. It appears as the supply chain is largely international, with the likes of China and others. So how important do you think it is to make that supply chain more domestic or North American, if you will, to make that supply chain more robust?
Yeah, so this is absolutely critical for national security. Is one bent you can take, but just another bent, just think practically in our world today. Logistics costs have gone crazy. Just the world is hard, right, in terms of making things happen. So we've gone away from this world where you wouldn't care about those things in a very globalized world. But today, even the most typical parts of the business may be difficult. So those two things together, like geopolitical aspect plus that, are driving a huge effort on localization. And the battery supply chain is pretty complicated. There are many different steps. Like, we're one cog in that broader machine, and recycling is really important to keep the materials domestically where they end up being available to be recycled. But we also need, the cathode makers, the companies that supply the cathode makers. We need cell making, we need auto making, of course, as well, and eventually as well, and the aspects in between. So super important. I think the encouraging thing is in the last while, we've seen huge activity to properly localize that, and that's very different than 2 years ago. So it's been very positive on that front, I would say.
Got it. So let's talk about the actual business, right? So who are your customers? Talk about some of those relationships. What does that look like? Where are you making money? What's the business line?
Yeah, so fundamentally, and like simply put, our business model ultimately is to primarily make money off selling the materials. So think of LICY ultimately. We're a recycling company, but also think of us as a sustainable battery materials company. So
a real ESG company, not just the buzzword.
Yeah, it's a very fortunate thing, right? Like, our core business, if you do this the right way, is like inherently sustainable, right? And both triple bottom line sustainable, which is really cool. That's why it's very easy to attract people to work for us, which is fortunate. So when we think about rolling out what we're doing, and sorry, Dave, just go back. Sorry, where did you want to touch on?
Sorry, I distracted you. The business model, customers, who you're selling to.
Yeah. So in terms of customers, I touched on how we make money. So in terms of actual customers, there's really two aspects to that. And recycling is always interesting because you have to be dealing with both the input and the output. Yeah. So we consider actually that we have two customers, which is really both the feed side and the offtake side. On the feed side, we have over 100 battery supply customers, really diverse. So think of, I've really distilled it down into 4 categories. We have manufacturing scrap, so rejected materials from making of batteries. We have energy storage systems. I was talking about that they're a little bit like projects that may be decommissioned. So that's been an interesting growing segment. Of course, you then have after sales of electric vehicles. So meaning they go on the road. So imagine you have an EV, you have an issue, you take it back to the dealership, then it comes back to a group like us. So that's the third segment. And then fourth and finally, people will probably think about your consumer appliances, your phones, your tablets, right? And the batteries there. So the groups that we work with, I said over 100. Some that are public are LG. LG is the biggest battery maker outside of China for EVs. They're also an investor. I'll get to the offtake component in a moment. We also work closely, for example, with Lithium, a joint venture of GM and LG. So that's a domestic battery cell production effort. They're ramping up now. We work with Mercedes-Benz on the OEM side. We work with VW, Audi in Canada, Mercedes-Benz in Canada as well. So on and on. So we have a very diverse network on each of those segments, and that's been very important for us to grow it in lockstep so that we're building assets basically in staggered effect with when the batteries are coming to us. So that's one customer segment. And then secondly, and finally, as I mentioned, we're making product, we're selling product. Glencore and another group named Traxys, we've taken the tack here of going with offtake and marketing groups that give us the certainty of being able to sell the product. So they are offtake agreements, but we retain the flexibility to direct the material to certain downstream groups. Why we did that, we wanted certainty, of course, of selling it, but this supply chain has been very fluid. And so we didn't want to be allocating X amount of our nickel or lithium to a group and then find out 4 years later, oh my gosh, we actually want to link it to what we're getting from a different group and then be at a lockstep. So that's actually proven to be a very sound strategy. And that's the increasing trend, is closing the loop, linking the input with the output, like with LG. So LG is an example where there's scrap, and then there's offtake for the end material. So I'll pause it, but basically 2 customer groups, intake, offtake.
Right. And you mentioned this. So, and LG and Glen have both just recently invested. Is that correct?
That's right. So LG, the investment closed in May. Glencore, the investment closed in June. So both are strategic investments. We weren't really necessarily seeking the dollars only. In the case of LG, I just touched on it. There's an intake and an offtake aspect. So scrap and offtake for nickel. The Glencore relationship, interestingly, Glencore, and it's interesting, I've learned not that many people know Glencore necessarily, but they are the biggest producer of cobalt in the world and a top 3 producer of the nickel needed for electric vehicles in the world. So they're a very important participant in this supply chain. And this is an example, just quickly, where we're combining, I was talking about their supply, hey, how do we solve this critical material supply issue, plus get that recycled content over time? Well, this is an example where we can work with them to provide that as a solution to vehicle manufacturers, for example. They need to solve both their today issue, which is where am I going to get the material from, and their growing need, which is how we're going to grow it into recycled content over time. So that's just a really high level on how we're working with Glencore, but it's a very strategic, foundational agreement and partner for us.
Got it. And so if we could talk a little bit maybe about competition. So I guess it's twofold. I guess first off, the tech that you utilize that's unique to Li-Cycle, is that proprietary? Like others aren't doing the same process, if you will.
Yeah. So if I simply put, if we think about our competitive advantage, it's really around 2 spheres. One is technology and one is commercial. So on the technological side, as you just said, that is patent protected. We've developed it. And there's a range of IP between both our spoke and our hub. People often ask us, hey, what's more important? Where's the IP? Like your spoke or your hub? Like people usually, I think, assume that it's the hub. Yeah. But actually, to be frank, it's both. I'll give you an example on that front, and then I'll get to the commercial side. Yeah. It's something people can relate to. So in like Tesla's new cars, CATL is a massive battery maker, BYD massive battery maker. They've moved to this format where in the chassis of your vehicle, there's a big pack. And so originally you'd have like cells, which are the individual batteries, and then assembled into these groups of cells called modules, and then modules assembled into a pack. What these groups have gone to is just cells in a pack. So you'd open that pack in the chassis of your vehicle, and you just see like cells upon cells. So recyclers outside of us, what they would traditionally do, and others still do this, they dismantle those packs down to a cell level. Now, that typically relies on manual labor, and you would then need it to be friendly in these sort of modules to be able to be disassembled. Well, the reality is industry is moving away from that. So one of the ways that we've innovated, as an example, as part of our IP, we don't dismantle, we don't discharge, we minimize that human input at the beginning. This is at the spokes, as an example. And we shred those full packs as is. So in Arizona, which is our latest spoke that's been operational, in Alabama coming up, that's how we do things. You literally would see a pack going on the conveyor as is into the shredder, and that's the only facility of its kind in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about an advantage moving forward, that enables scalability. It allows us to be, have a larger aperture in terms of where materials coming from. So a whole bunch of benefits. That's just one example. There's many on the technology.
Mm-hmm.
The second one, and lastly, and I mentioned there a sphere of commercial. Look, you can't do this business if you don't have the feed and batteries coming in. You can't do it if you have a place to sell the product. So we've spent years getting to where we are. It takes time, especially with vehicle battery makers, to build that confidence, show that we can actually do what we say we do, and qualify. So we're now in the place where it's kind of that snowball effect of growth. But if somebody were to start today on that front, it would be challenging because it's a bit of a chicken and egg. You kind of have to show what you're doing already and already be operating before you can go to one of these groups and say, well, I want X. It's not really how it works. You have to be already in the flow. And so that hence becomes an advantage for us as well.
Right. So let's talk about what's up next, near term priority. So you mentioned Arizona's up and running. I believe you're building Rochester. So what's there to talk about there?
Yeah, look, I'd say as a broad theme, I think about catalysts for the company, execution is number one focus. Obviously with existing operations with the spokes, and so I'll just divide it into the spoke and the hub segments. So on the spoke side, we have 3 operational: Kingston, Rochester, Arizona. Alabama is coming on stream, and then looking at a 5th spoke as well in North America. And then in Europe, which has been exciting as well, building in Norway and Germany. So those are coming on stream. That's basically like the leading indicator before we get the hub on, and continue to execute that is important. And it's also how we fulfill customer needs that are there today in terms of batteries that we're given. So something to keep an eye out for. That continues to be an ongoing level of progress. The big catalyst, of course, people have attention on is the hub.
Mm-hmm.
So that's our, hydro-metallurgical is the term, wet chemistry, chemical facility in Rochester, New York. We're in the old Kodak Business Park. We're there because we're leveraging great infrastructure. So where we're at is we are well into, project execution. There's construction happening on site. Things are coming out of the ground, so starting to become much more visual. We mobilized the site probably about, this is now 8-9 months ago, so towards the end of last year, calendar year. And a bunch of great milestones in between. We have our key permits on hand, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. We're moving through now with execution. So for us, this is so important financially, of course, for the company. This is really the full realization of both parts of the model together. Internally, flight school, very important, but externally for the US, and just to bring it back to the big picture, look, we'll be the first new, quite significant production source of lithium and battery grade nickel and cobalt in the US before any other announced facility. And a large part of the ability that we've been able to do that is the technology, choosing to go, we're talking about sustainability and a truly sustainable approach, but then actually making it happen and get our permits. I think permitting will be, for some parts of the supply chain, one of the major hurdles, and even for recyclers, depending on what you're doing. So very exciting. We'll continue to give periodic updates on that project as we progress, but it's been a really exciting, transformative time in terms of where we're at.
For sure. And so to the extent that you can discuss, I know you had been aiming for profitability, I think by the end of 2024. Can you comment on if you're tracking there, or sort of what you're seeing for future guidance at all to profitability?
Yeah, you're right to say that we haven't necessarily talked out there specifically about it, but what I would say is at the end of the day, 2 things. So today we have our spokes, we're making black mass and selling black mass, and when we do that, which is that cathode anode material, it's sold at a discount of the nickel and cobalt value within. So it's a way to get some churn in the system, some value, but that's not really the end model. And that was good a couple of years ago, but we're going to get to a point now as we get towards the hub where there's way more value, meaning a multiple of that value that we can get out from extracting the lithium, the nickel, the cobalt. So that model end to end together is really the enabling effect for the economics.
Mhm.
And of course, we're going to transition from finishing execution of the project to commissioning to ramp up. So yeah, so that's where we're headed. And the public thing we've said out there is we continue to be on track for starting commissioning of the Rochester hub in calendar 2023. So that's where complete laser focus is on. Let's continue to execute the spokes and improve our operational efficiency of the existing spokes as well.
An intense 6 months ahead.
Yeah, it's been the other side of this, which is on the softer side is just the organizational growth, right? Like a year ago we were 120 maybe people. Today we're over 350. So a large part of this, which is not pertinent for IR, but it's we have to figure out inside is just changing the company into that execution company, internal process, internal rigor. Yeah. So our jobs, even Tim and me, they've changed like 5-6 times in our history. And that's really the focus now, right? Is okay, these are the plans and we're executing on them. And how do you enable the team to get them?
I actually kind of wanted to wrap on something similar. So obviously, for us, we're focused on SPACs, and so that's kind of why we like talking to de-SPAC companies to see how it's going, from going from private to public. So I think it's been almost exactly a year.
Tomorrow, that's right, August 11th,
since your public debut. So first, congrats on getting out when you did. It's a much more difficult SPAC market these days. But two, any early reflections on your first year as a public company CEO? Anything surprising or more difficult than you would have expected?
Yeah, I think nothing too different than what we expected. I mean, we have some experience around the hoop on the executive team, with being at public companies. I think the big thing for us, just as a broader comment, is obviously in the macro, and then how you manage that internally. The macro is the macro. We can't control that. It's exogenous, and so that is what it is. But what we can control is executing again the things I talked about in terms of focus from the team. So I think that's the most important thing as we keep the eye on the prize for the team and everybody internally. And there's a great energy, positive energy here. So I think that's one. I think the second thing is, which has been really interesting for me, is if you look at, again, you try to shut it out a bit, but all the conversation from a macroeconomic perspective, what's happening. But if you look at our industry, and the favorite thing I'd like to do is just get on a call with one of our customers, just sit in on one of our commercial team's calls, and you listen to our customers. At the end of the day, they're not slowing down. When you look at the EV demand, I think there'll be some bumps in the road here as people try to get cars out, but it's there. And so the fundamental secular drivers of our industry not changed, they've only got better. So that's really energizing, and it's just something we have to always balance. And I think some companies, maybe these similar shoes, right, for similar industry, you're still facing the same growth, the same secular trends, but there's a very different tone on the other side. And that is what it is. That's part of public company life. So that's been, I think, one of the biggest interesting things, I think, for me.
I mean, your stock price actually is kind of held up relative to some of the others. How hard is it to block out, day-to-day movements in share price versus, focusing on execution?
I think for everybody's pretty hard.
I like that honest answer.
I'd be lying if I said otherwise. But I mean, we're aware, but I think what does help is, as I just said, is we're always working in a space where, to be frank, that has pertinence, but it's our day-to-day, we're looking at things that are well beyond that, if you know what I mean. So if you spend your time there, we're spending our time there on the things that matter. We know that will take care of itself. We have to do our part, obviously, on the IR side, but that's how we think, and I think that's just the same tone is important to get in the organization, and I think it is there, which is good, and just not falling into the trap of trying to manage the share price, manage the company. The share price will manage itself, right? So.
Well, spoken like a true CEO. Well, Ajay, thanks for taking the time. Really exciting to follow you guys, sustainability, the growth of EVs. So it was awesome to learn more about your business. Any final words of wisdom that you'd like to impart?
Yeah, I would just say, look, I think life cycle continues to be at a really exciting inflection point. I think I touched on it there in terms of, being first to market, the great moat, technologically, commercially, the first to market with production of domestic battery materials, which you just look at the Inflation Reduction Act, looked at all the discussion happening around us. That is like the focus. So we are right at the bullseye of all these different trends. And as I said, focus on executing, making it happen. So
Awesome.
that's what folks should look out for as we continue to push ahead.
Great. Awesome. Best of luck. And we'll keep an eye out. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, David. Nice to chat to you.